one of the things about your work, you really have a real talent and a skill for drawing out these kind of glaring double standards, as you just did with respect to the so-called defense industry and the public health defense that we really needed this last couple of years. I want to follow up, though, with what might sound like devil's advocacy. It's how, of course, we need to conjure the devil here. We don't have a lot of pro-capitalists involved in this production of shelter and solidarity. But some have now, with the creation of the vaccines, the Pfizer, the Moderna, the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, we're actually hearing a narrative out there that actually it seems to almost try to erase the kinds of lessons you've just called attention to by underscoring, right, the innovative genius of capitalism, maybe holding as if to hold out a hope that maybe capitalism can produce the vaccines for the problems that it generates or that it encounters. And look how innovative and effective and how relatively quickly these private corporations develop these vaccines. Isn't this proof that capitalism still has a claim on our loyalty, even if it's so abusive and undemocratic, yada, yada, yada? What's your take on the vaccine development and deployment process and what it actually reveals about the system we're living under?
I don't understand how that could be a defense of anything. I'm the first one to agree that if we, as a society, decided we wanted to have a preparation for viruses, of course we could do that. And if we wanted as a society to have in place the laboratories and the scientific personnel to respond to any new illness with a maximum effort, of course we could do it. But the point is, we don't. We don't over and over again. And to take the example of the vaccines, let's be real clear. The vaccines were produced because the government took away all capitalist risk. It guaranteed I'm all shot up with vaccines. I didn't pay a nickel. I don't pay anything. None of you have to pay either. But of course, you think those companies are giving us those vaccines for free? Don't be crazy. They are all paid for. And in fact, you're paying for them only through your taxes. They go to the government, and the government said to these companies, you have no risk. I want you to take, half your laboratory scientists and go to work on this virus. I love it. If you have a concentrated commitment to do something right, you can do it. We don't. We come up when it's too late to do the viruses. If we had been properly prepared, we wouldn't need the dependence on Let me drive it home, which may upset some of you, but it's the truth, and you've got to look at it sooner or later. The People's Republic of China is a country 4 times larger than our own. Most estimates put the population of People's Republic somewhere between 1.3 and 1.4 billion people. 4 times the number of people, and a much poorer country than the United States. You know how many dead people have died from COVID in China? Between 7 and 8,000. We have between 7 and 800,000. A country 4 times larger has a tiny 1% fraction of the deaths from COVID. That's not just a failure. That is, I lack the capacity of vocabulary to capture this. And by the way, why did the Chinese do a better job? And they're not the only ones. Don't think that I picked a country that's socialist because it's the only solution. Take a look at New Zealand, not a socialist country, but it does have an extraordinary leader, and she is so effective. If you don't know the leader of New Zealand, go find out about her. You're one of the greatest leaders the world has right now. And for those of you that are women, okay, it's a woman. And that you don't see that very often. Not that it's the whole explanation, but you don't have to be a socialist country. You have to be a country that can mobilize public and private resources to get the job done to which you give a priority. And saving the lives of 1 million people, that ought to be, if you're any morality at all, a primary objective. So what did the Chinese do? They mobilized all the resources. The public, the private, they have a huge private economic sector in China. So don't think of it, huge part of their production and distribution of goods is capitalist enterprises, both Chinese and foreign, that are busy there. But the government maintains a control and a dominance and an ability to focus its resources. And by the way, it's not just for emergencies like COVID, where they have outperformed the United States on a scale that is so enormous that you don't hear about it very much because it's so embarrassing. But let me give you two other indices. I'm just an economist. I'm just giving you the numbers. You can see what you want to do with them as you like. For the last 25 years, one of the basic statistics that all economists use is something called GDP, and it stands for Gross Domestic Product. Think of it as the total output of goods and services. So it's a kind of measure of how big an economy is and how it's growing. And one of the big things we look at is the annual growth of GDP in every country. So for the last 25 years, the average annual growth of GDP in the United States has been between 2 and 2.5%, maybe 3%. Over the exact same 25 years, the rate of growth of the People's Republic of China GDP has averaged between 6 and 9%. Do you understand the Chinese economy is growing 3 times faster than the United States, which is why economists expect it will pass the United States as a total economy before the end of the decade we're already in. Now, let me give you another final statistic. One of the things economists are interested in is what we call real wages. What that is the amount of money you get in your pay envelope relative to the prices you have to pay for the milk and the eggs and the shirts and all the stuff you have to buy. So it's an adjustment of your wage to take into account what you can afford to buy with it. The real wage in the United States over the last 25 years has been what we call in America stagnant. It's gone nowhere. The truth of it is, and by the way, explains a great deal of the turmoil in our country, that the average real wage in this country is the same today as it was around 1980. We have subjected our people to 40 years of going nowhere, which has had 2 consequences you have to keep in mind. Number one, how then do we account for the rising consumption level of our people? Well, you know the answer. Starting in 1980, the American people took on a level of debt no working class in the history of the world ever carried before. Americans are drowning in debt. Think about it. Think about it. Back to the real wage. Over the last 25 years, that real wages have been stagnant in the United States. I'm now going to tell you what happened to the real wage of the average Chinese worker. Ready? It quadrupled. It's 4 times today what it was 25 years ago. Now you can play around and dance around and fool yourself, but the world doesn't stay still because Americans need to deny what's going on in the world. I know for 20 years we were told that we're going to have a surge and we're going to have this and we're going to win the war in Afghanistan. Oh, we all now know that that was, to use a technical term, bullshit. And we lost. And we're about to have the same experience in Iraq. Okay? And we already lost Vietnam. We're not doing real well, friends. And it's buried left and right because we live in a country that is now suffering from denial on a scale that is mind-bending. But for all of these reasons, It's precisely what we could have accomplished when we did focus our scientific community in the only way you can get that done, when there's profit in the way, by guaranteeing profits. And if you have any doubt, let me invite you to do a little experiment you can do on your own. There are only 6 or 7 major drug companies in the United States. You know their names. Go look up what happened to their shares, value of their stocks over the last 2 years, 6 years, 12 years. Pharmaceuticals are one of the greatest profit engines in this country, and they have been for a long time. And that's because they have a monopoly. Insurance companies, those 4 industries have what's called a group monopoly. How do I know? One final statistic, because I don't want to throw them all at you at once. The United States spends a bigger share of its GDP on healthcare than any other country in the world. And no other country is even close. Is that because we take care of the health of our people more than others? Not at all. If you look, for example, at longevity, how many years people live on average, we're mediocre. We're in the middle. We're the only major country that over the last 4 years has seen life expectancy shrink in the United States. No, the country has this. We're achieving these dubious milestones. Wow. Wow. And you know, a reasonable person would scratch his or her head. We pay more for healthcare than anybody else, and our results in terms of our health are mediocre. Normally, if it was rationality here, you would question a system that works like that. It's on is the denial and the mental refusal to face. But you know, I don't want to be mean-spirited. I don't. I really don't. So I need to ask the question, why? And let me leave this part of our conversation with a general thought. From 1820 to 1970, the United States was an exceptional capitalist economy. The people who set it up came from Europe. They were not nice to the local people. They slaughtered them. The first ethnic cleansing right here. But that gave them a continent, having extinguished the local population, except for a few. And they took that continent and they created a capitalism that could just go, because unlike in Europe, it wasn't held back by centuries of feudalism and all these other traditions. If you're a tourist today and you go to France, you go and you look at magnificent chateaus, but those come from a pre-capitalist society. They're beautiful, and capitalism has never been able to make anything as beautiful, which is why the tourists go there. But this system took off. And from 1820 to 1970, it made a lot of money, it developed its technology, and it outgalloped every other competitor. Above all, the 3 big competitor countries: Britain, from whom we had split, Germany, which was the other up and coming, and Japan. And in World War I, Britain and Germany wrecked each other. And in World War II, the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Americans demolished Japan. So we, the American economy, has had no serious economic competitor for a century. The Soviet Union was so far behind economically that it was never a threat that way. It had nuclear weapons, that's an issue, but we are in an entirely new situation, friends. And for those of you that are young, this is your life laying out before you. The People's Republic of China is the first serious competitor this country has had in a century. By 1970, the American experienced this growth, explosive growth for 150 years, which, by the way, created in America this idea that we are exceptional, because no other country had that. No other country had that 150 years of growth. Nobody had an empty continent cleared of people, very well, fertile and with good harbors and rivers and all the things the United States had. So it took off. Wow. But by 1970, it couldn't grow anymore the way it had. And so things started to change. Large numbers of American capitalists left the United States. That's why, if you look at the label on your shirt or your underpants or your socks, you already know what you'll find. Not made here, made over there. China, India, Brazil, you name it. They left. They're all patriotic on the 4th of July, but when the money counts, they left because wages are cheap out there. And that's why it's so cheap that it pays to move your factory from Cincinnati to Shanghai and then pay for bringing that crap all the way back here because you're still going to be ahead, which is why they left. And the other factories, when they couldn't leave, replaced their workers with machines. That's what the computer allowed them to do. And for the service industries that can't move abroad and can't use a machine, they brought in cheap immigrants in huge numbers. And that made them a ton of money. Being in the stock market over the last 25 years, smart move. But for the rest of the people, down. And they staved off the unpleasant recognition of what was happening to them by borrowing money like it was going out of style. Borrow for your home, that's called a mortgage. Borrow for your car, that's that monthly payment. Borrow for your everyday bottle of water by using your credit card at the local bodega. And then the really new one, when that wasn't enough debt to drown you in, college debt. Spend the money to get your kid to get a degree, which is less useful for getting a good job than it ever was. What kind of a society functions like this? A big, fat capitalist one, because everything's about making the money. And that's my argument, because if you want to produce well, the Americans have shown they can do that. American workers are perfectly good. We can produce all kinds of things and we do a good job. But the profit gets in the way. And the people who are concentrating on making profit, that's their focus. And you all have to ask yourself, as I do, if we want public health, if we want decent housing for our people, if we want education that allows every person to get as much skill and intellectual capability as he or she is capable of getting, well, then we can't have these institutions be focused on something else called profit. Absolutely. And if you believe, as the conservatives want you to, that by some magic, a capitalist trying to maximize profit will end up doing what's best for all of us, if you actually believe that, then I want to sell you a special corner in the Brooklyn Bridge.